The state's top judge wants to see fewer young offenders tried in adult criminal court. New York has actually long dealt with 16 and 17-year-old defendants more harshly than almost any other state, prosecuting them as adults in criminal courts. However, Chief Judge Jonathan Lippman says that sending nonviolent offenders to family court could actually lower the rate of recidivism. And he would like to see the law changed so these cases can automatically be handled by family court. Joining me now to explain more about this plan is Judge Lippman himself. Judge, it is great to see you again.
Great to speak to you, Liz. Pleasure.
So actually, it's not just one of a handful. It's New York and North Carolina, and that's it, period.
Literally, there are 48 states in the country that do not have the age of criminal responsibility at 16 years old. And shortly, we may wind up being the last state in the country because the North Carolina legislature is considering these issues right now.
So we should be clear, we are not talking about severe situations like murder or violent rape, for example.
The age of criminal responsibility in New York for murder is 13 years old, and for violent felonies like rape, aggravated assault, armed robbery is 14. That will not change, and we are not talking about violent crime. We're talking about relatively minor crime, trespassing, fare beating, low-level drug crime.
Got it.
Those kinds of lower-level crimes that we think belong in the family court, where the approach is rehabilitation and the best interest of the child, rather than the adult courts, where the approach is all about punishment and incarceration.
Now, actually, my understanding that the Family Court Act was enacted in 1962. That's when the age of criminal responsibility was established at 16, and this was supposed to be revisited, and it never was?
Yes, this was a temporary fix in 1962 in order to study the matter, and we've been studying it for 50 years. And in my view, we've studied it long enough, and we ought to get on the fast track so we don't wind up being the last state in the country, because clearly all of the studies show that recidivism rates are much higher for 16 and 17-year-olds when they go through the criminal courts than when they go through the family courts, as much as there was one study between New Jersey and New York that showed that the chances of committing a violent crime were 85% higher when you come out of the criminal courts than when you do out of the family courts for 16 and 17-year-olds, and 45% higher chance of you committing a felony property crime when you're processed in the criminal court rather than the family court. And on top of that, when these adolescents whose brain development is not as advanced to a less mature go through the criminal court, they get a conviction on their record. When they seek jobs or housing or education, they have difficulties, while in family court you're charged with delinquency, and that's not the case. You can honestly say, I've never had a conviction, or the case is sealed, and you can lead a meaningful life thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we should just be careful here, obviously. Look, if you send a young person to an adult facility and you send them through the court system and they end up somewhere where they are meeting folks who are older and hardened criminals, they're going to learn bad habits, certainly. But some of these kids are coming from a difficult background, obviously, but what happens when you have a kid who's coming through the system more than once? I mean, like the three strikes sort of situation.
Look, what the family court does is it intervenes as intervention into the life of this adolescent. They see what the family situation is. They try and deal with it. You're dealing with these kinds of minor crimes with a whole different approach. There can be repeat criminals in the criminal court, and in the family court, kids who keep getting into trouble. But there's different approaches to dealing with it, and our point is that you're not serving public safety by putting these kids through the criminal court system, because the chances of having a repeat offender, a recidivism on the part of these kids is so much greater in the criminal courts. The goal is to get their life together and allow them to have to be meaningful, productive members of society.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to do here.
Okay, so I think that most people could probably understand that if you cut the recidivism rate, in the long term your cost is probably less, right? Because you have fewer people in the system. It's a good thing. But what you're suggesting here is actually pretty comprehensive. You need to actually revise the entire system so you have more money and focus on the juvenile facilities, on the court system, on social services. How much money are we talking about?
We don't know the exact number. We're running those numbers now, but I would point to a study in North Carolina, the other state in the same shape as New York, by the Vera Institute, which indicated that both in the short and long term, the cost savings exceed by a great amount the increased costs that they have to put in. So we believe that while there will be some initial investment, the savings that you get by reduced arrests, people in prison, social services will outweigh the costs of revitalizing the system. It's possible you'll need family court judges, more family court judges, a more robust probation system, but we think the cost will be very manageable, and if anything, based on the studies so far, the savings will probably be greater than the cost, and we're looking at that now in order to make the case.
Right. So what you're also going to attempt in order to make the case is sort of a pilot program. Is that right? You're going to try to establish sort of a mini adolescent court system within the existing system. When are you going to do that?
Absolutely. We're going to have judges who are specially trained in the legal and psychosocial issues of dealing with adolescents, and they will be trained in interventions like the family court to get into the family life, what are the problems, and there'll be parts in the criminal court with these specially trained judges that will treat it from this rehabilitative approach rather than an approach that emphasizes punishment and incarceration, because we want to prove very concretely that this new way of looking at this will work, because all of the science tells us that's the case, and the U.S. Supreme Court has acknowledged this by saying that you can't have the death penalty for homicides under 18. You can't have for serious felonies under 18, non-homicide cases. You can't have life without parole. Why? Because adolescents are different. They're less mature. And certainly for these lower level crimes, we believe that these new parts will demonstrate that this is a better approach, number one, in terms of public safety, and number two, in terms of the well-being of our communities around the state. And we'll have pilots in New York City, the suburbs, and upstate to show that this is the case.
Okay, well, Chief Judge, obviously, I think we're probably going to be talking about this for some time. That we have not heard the governor weigh in yet. We have the Senate GOP, which tends to be a little bit more tough on crime, and then the Assembly Democrats, which tend to be a little more trending in the direction that I think you're talking about, which is holistic, if you will. So we shall see. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much, Chief Judge Jonathan Lippman, for being with us. It is great to see you.
Oh, my pleasure, Liz. I want to tell you, we've had preliminary soundings with all of them, and no one is saying this is a terrible idea. Everyone's saying, let's look at it.
Okay. Well,
so
that is certainly good news for your cause. We will be following it. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Liz. Always a pleasure.